Welcome to Part 3 of the Utility Sales Training. I'm Frederick Cade, and I'm the Air Force Utility Reimbursements Program Manager, working at AFCEC Energy Rates and Renewables Division.
And I'm Jim Snook. I provide support to Fred Cade, and from 1992 through 2010, I worked at AFCEC on the Utility Rates Management team. From 1995 through 2010, I was the manager for the Utility Reimbursement Program. This is Part 3 of a three-part series on utility sales. Part 1 is for the base civil engineer and civil engineering leadership. Part 2 is for civil engineering management. That is the flight chiefs and supporting personnel within civil engineering. And this part, Part 3, is for the utility engineer. These three presentations are independent of each other. You can watch Part 3 without having watched Parts 1 and 2. In Part 3, we will provide a thorough step-by-step description of how to calculate utility sales rates. This will include a description of how to use the Air Force Form 3556, which is Utility Sales Rate Computation Worksheet, to do these calculations. This slide shows a small view of the United States Air Force utility budget. The budget is approximately $1 billion, and out of that $1 billion, the Air Force collects $200 million from utility sales customers to cover the cost of those utility services. Utility sales reimbursement is a significant revenue towards the utility budget. This shows the annual Air Force utility costs as part of the Air Force O&M budget, and how the revenue from the utility sales impact the entire O&M budget. Now, the O&M budget is approximately $35 billion. And what you can see here in the green is the utility sales revenue. In the blue, you see the appropriated funds, which are used to pay for utility costs. And in the red, it's the remainder of the annual O&M budget. You can see in the first slide where we've done the current collection of utility reimbursements. You can see that approximately $200 million is collected. The next bar, missed opportunity, shows if, in fact, all the utility sales customers are not correctly identified and all those sales dollars are not collected, what happens is those dollars or those utility costs are paid with appropriated funds. That comes out of the O&M budget. In the third bar, you can see all reimbursables identified. If all the utility sales customers were correctly identified and all the utility sales dollars collected, in fact, what would happen, we would collect an extra amount. We would free up O&M dollars to be used for other purposes for the Air Force. A question comes up frequently, and that is this. We're calling this collection of dollars revenue. We're going to talk about the statute, which provides the authority to collect these monies and use them to pay for utility service. So there is specific statutory authority to collect these monies, and we'll talk about that on next slide. Within the utility service on a base, there are two categories of customers. Non-reimbursable customers, and those are the customers that the BCE provides service to those customers without any charge. The reimbursable customers are the ones that we're focusing on in this presentation. Those customers reimburse the base civil engineer for utility service. There are several statutes that provide us authority to do these things and also provide restrictions on what we can do. For example, 10 U.S.C. 2494 specifically says appropriated funds may be used to provide utility service for MWR customers. However, Statute 2491A specifically limits the use of appropriated funds for DOD golf courses within the United States. The most important statute we have is 10 U.S.C. 2686, and that is the authority for the sale of utility service to non-federal customers. It says specifically that you can provide utility service to a customer on the installation or near the installation if that service is not available from another local source, and that sale is in the interest of national defense or in the public interest. A very similar statute is 10 U.S.C. 2872A, which provides authority to provide utilities and other services to privatized housing. As far as utility service is concerned, 2872A is very similar to 2686, except a limitation was removed. Under 2686, you can only sell utility service to a customer on the base if it's not available from another source. Under 2872, that restriction does not exist. Utility service can be provided to privatized housing even if it's available from another source. And in addition, other services were added beyond utility service for privatized housing, including items such as pest control, snow and ice removal, telecommunications, firefighting, and police service. The last statute on the list there, 31 U.S.C. 9701, speaks about the amount to be charged for utility service. And that statute says that it's the sense of Congress that the service provided be self-sustaining to the extent possible, and that charge for the service be fair and based on the cost of the service to the government, the value of the service, any public policy or interest served, and any other relevant facts. For the two categories of customers that we have discussed, funding for non-reimbursable customers is from appropriated funds. Funding for the reimbursable customers, as we've said, comes from the customer themselves. Now, for these customers, sales agreements required for those customers, except for medical and housing. Their utility services paid by charging their fund site directly for their service. No service agreement or sales agreement is required for them. But utility sales agreements or service agreements are required for all other customers unless there's a memorandum of agreement or an inter-service support agreement that states otherwise. There are forms to be used for this, and the Form 3553 is used for service for non-federal organizations. 3554 is used for DOD agencies and non-DOD federal agencies, and Form 4386 is used for privatized military family housing. There are some exceptions. For example, thrift shops have a special exemption, are non-reimbursable. One of the things you're going to find as you go through this, there are all kinds of exceptions and rabbit holes that you need to watch out for, which you can find in AFI 321061. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. For example, the non-federal government customers include private and public schools. Non-government organizations would include Civil Air Patrol. Commercial customers would include freestanding banks and credit unions, and the DOD rate also includes golf courses. Here we're going to talk about the basics of how you calculate a utility sales rate. Now, some variation of the method we're going to discuss here today is used by every utility company in the United States. The company determines for a one-year period how much it will cost to operate the entire organization. They also then determine the quantity of service they will provide through that year. So where we're going to determine the total dollars and the total service provided for a year. Now that service, the units on that service could be kilowatt hours for electricity, million BTUs of gas, decatherms of gas, could be thousands of cubic feet or thousands of gallons of water. After the total dollars and the total units of service for a year are determined, a sales rate is calculated by dividing the annual cost by the annual quantity to be provided. Then, this sales rate, say for example $1 per kilowatt hour, is used monthly to calculate the invoice that's sent to the customer. Let's look at this a little more detail on the next slide. So the essential requirements for collecting utility revenue. Now, for any company to collect for utility service, all of these things have to be done. But the focus of the presentation that we're making here today is on how to calculate the utility sales rate. The other The other items are important, but that's not what we're talking about today, okay? You'll have to identify customers, calculate the sales rate, provide service, read the meters or estimate the monthly quantity, then send an invoice and collect the money. These are the basic things that have to be done to collect for utility service. We'll say this, we're back to words again. When I say sales rate, I could call that a utility rate or I could call that a resales rate, but it's all the same thing. It's the rate charged for the provision of utility service. You can see an important point for us is all the customers on the Air Force Base already receive service. They're hooked up to the system, and one of two things will happen. If they're reimbursable customers, one of two things will happen. Either they'll be identified and we will send them bills and collect for that service, or the service will be provided free and paid for from appropriated funds. You can see at the bottom is a bumper sticker. This is the first bumper sticker used in the presentation. It identifies the common problem, which is to identify all reimbursable customers. These bumper stickers are describing for you the problems that are routinely found when the auditors review the base utility sales program, and you will see them throughout the presentation. AFI 32-1061 is the resource for utility sales program, and we'll talk about a little more about that on the next slide. You have to read and understand 32-1061. The other thing you're going to need is a current version of the Air Force Form 3556. And a very common mistake that's made is the base utility engineer will take last year's Air Force Form 3556, calculate the new numbers that need to be put in the form, and replace the old numbers with the new numbers on the form. This is not a good plan. And there's a reason that it's not a good plan is when changes to the guidance are made, they're made on the Air Force Form 3556, and that form is posted on the AFCEC website. If you use last year's form, you will not get those changes incorporated into your utility sales rate calculations. What you need to do is download the current form from the AFCEC website, check the revision date, and make sure that you have the current form. If the form that you have is not the current form, you'll have to start with the current form and use that. Now, let's talk some more about cost elements and cost data. There'll be more and more coming on that stuff. Here is an overview of the Air Force Instruction 32-1061, which is providing utilities to U.S. Air Force installations. This is both an educational and a reference tool. If you get it, print it, read it, mark it up, and keep it handy. This will provide you with the background information and the reference information you need to calculate your utility sales rates. Here we can see a blank Form 3556, and on the next slide we'll show a little more detail. Here you can see the upper part of the Air Force Form 3556. What we'll do today is discuss the sources of data and where they are entered in this form. You can see the data input section right here. You can see here the Air Force Form 3556, the lower part of the form, the details, which shows rate calculations. We'll discuss the rate calculations and how the form calculates the cost elements and which utility rates are charged to the customers. And of course, last but not least, note in the lower left corner the revision date for that form. This is the reverse side of the Air Force Form 3556. This is a worksheet for calculating the charges for utility service if it is used in the on-base production of a utility commodity. And we'll give some examples of that and show an exact example for you to understand that. These are the elements of the utility rate, which are entered or calculated by the Air Force Form 3556 for sales rates. And these are described in detail in AFI 32-1061. Here we'll talk about the cost element capital investment. Capital investment is the cost incurred by the Air Force to install the utility system. So it includes the original MILCON projects, any MILCON additions, any O&M projects which upgrade or add capacity to the system. One thing you want to remember, if the utility system has been recently privatized, to recalculate and check the capital investment to make sure that your capital investment number doesn't include the cost of a system that's been sold through utility privatization. Where this information is entered. Okay? This example, you can see data input capital investment is a 3556 for an electric system. In this briefing, we will be using 3 different examples to show different points on calculating utility sales. We'll use this electric form, we'll use an example for water, and we'll use an example for wastewater treatment. The reason we use different forms is there's different cost factors. They have to be processed to calculate the sales rates, so we use 3 different examples. So here you can see on this slide the capital investment value from the Air Force Form 7115 is entered in the upper left corner. That is the capital investment of the system. We're going to talk about the annual system capacity. The second factor that has to be entered in order to calculate the capital cost is the annual system capacity. I will caution you, the annual capacity is the maximum ability of the system to produce or deliver the utility commodity over 1 year. It is the throughput or output capacity, either in, let's say, water, gallons per minute, multiplied by the number of minutes in a year, 525,600 minutes. Now, the thing to remember, this is not the annual plant output or consumption. It doesn't match the annual purchase of water that shows up on the form somewhere else. For electricity, gas, water, or sewage treatment service, the maximum capacity is the contract demand specified in the contract or the capacity of the equipment installed to provide service. For on-base produced commodities, the maximum demand is the design capacity of the plant. For electricity, the maximum capacity is the total capacity of the prime plant minus the capacity of the single largest generator. Here is the electric service example, 3556, that shows the maximum capacity has been calculated and entered here on the Air Force Form 3556, and it's shown with capacity in kilowatt hours. If we purchase service, there's a place on the Air Force Form 3556 for the cost of that annual purchase to be entered. The purchase service is determined by totaling the amount spent and purchased from the monthly invoices over 1 year. What we're talking about there, purchase service, is essentially what we call or refer to as the utility commodity. So in that case, kilowatt hours, even though you can't see a kilowatt hour, we still discuss kilowatt hours as if they exist and you can touch them or see them. Purchase service example, 3556, is the electric service example. Here you can see the cost of service for the year. You can see the annual consumption amount purchased over the year. And also notice this, since the entire electric service commodity is purchased, there is no commodity produced on base, so the cost of that is none. There's no entry for that cost. We're going to talk a little bit about ownership of the utility system on the base. There's 2 types of utility privatization. Privatization is when the utility system has been sold, is no longer owned by the government, it's now owned by a private contractor. Under what we call utility privatization, a contractor owns the distribution system, and that's all he owns. Under a utility service by contractor, the contractor that owns the distribution system also provides a commodity. As we've discussed under electricity, if the utility provider, the local utility provider that was providing the commodity prior now owns the distribution system, he is now providing utility service right up to the buildings on the base. Caution, there's a caution here because these are different situations and they're entered in different places on the Air Force Form 3556, and we're going to talk a little more about that on the next slide. Under utility privatization, where the utility system has been sold, the BCE buys kilowatt hours in this electricity example. He buys kilowatt hours at the main substation from the local utility. Those kilowatt hours are delivered to on-base customers on behalf of the BCE by the utility privatization contractor. In this example, this is an electricity example, the on-base utility distribution system has been sold to a contractor. The BCE continues to purchase kilowatt hours from the local electric company at the main substation master meter, and those kilowatt hours are delivered to the customers on behalf of the BCE by the UP contractor. You can see the UP contractor now owns, operates, and maintains the on-base utility distribution system. That the utility privatization cost is a contract cost paid for by the Air Force. Those charges are entered in the Utilities Privatization section of the Air Force Form 3556. For this example, we've got an Air Force Form 3556 water system. Okay? In this case, the base is producing the commodity and the distribution system has been privatized. The distribution costs, the utility privatization costs, you can see are entered here under the Utilities Privatization section of the 3556. Note that since the distribution system has been privatized, there are no O&M charges associated with the Air Force maintaining that distribution system. Now we'll talk about the other example where we have utility service. In this situation, the local provider of utility service has purchased the on-base utility distribution system and is providing utility service to the buildings on the installation. The thing to remember is this. Just because the Air Force previously owned the distribution system on the base is no reason for the base civil engineer to pay part of the utility bill for reimbursable customers. An example here under electricity, the contractor, not the BCE, delivers kilowatt hours to the buildings. There's no separate utility privatization cost for that distribution. The contractor provides the utility service to the buildings, and he includes that cost in his cost of providing service. So the cost of service at the building is the incremental direct cost to provide service to the customer, and that cost is directly attributable to the customer. Here you see a 3556 example for wastewater treatment service, where the utility service is provided entirely by the contractor. In this situation, the annual cost is entered under purchased utility service. It is not entered under the utility privatization. You can see the total cost and amount of the annual purchase. You can see under utilities privatization there is no entry. Also note, for the capital cost and annual capacity sections on the form, there's no entries there because the Air Force no longer owns any facilities that provide this service. If there are payments made for utility energy service contracts or energy savings performance contract projects, these costs will be entered in the appropriate UESC or ESPC sections. The reason these are entered is those costs may be excluded from the cost for certain customers. An example is there is a change in process in 2014 to exclude those costs from the MWR AFES rates. Here's an example of 3556 for electric service that shows an annual payment made for an ESPC project. Now, Fred's going to discuss some more sources of input data.
There are numerous sources of information that are essential to identify the cost incurred to provide utility services. The slide gives an overview of the different sources within a CE squadron that a utility engineer can go to obtain information. While it is ultimately the utility engineer's responsibility to collect the information, Providing timely and accurate information is a team effort. And it goes without saying that the better the different sections cooperate with providing accurate information, the more successful the utility engineer will be in calculating the correct utility rates for reimbursable customers, the more reimbursable dollars that the BCE will be able to collect. What we're talking about now is sources of cost data. So if all the expenses are documented correctly, then the utility engineer would easily pull all expenses from the end of the year BCE cost report because all the expenses were properly documented in IWIMS. Information was properly documented in the correct account codes and all properly documented in the proper customer category codes. But we know that that's not always the case. And since that's not the case, the utility engineer has several ways to collect the data. We've already talked about where to find the data. That's what the last slide was. Now we will briefly discuss how to obtain that data. If the financial management section does not have a complete collection of all the cost from the different sources that we mentioned earlier, then the utility engineer will have to obtain the data from different POCs in the squadron. The utility engineer should go to an engineer or programmer and ask him or her to export all the project data in ACES. Now what you're going to get with that is that the project manager is going to come back and say, you want all of it? And the utility engineer is going to have to say, yes, I want all of it. Because the reason for this is that a lot of times the project engineers will overlook a specific type of project that has utility expenses in it. So if the utility manager pulls the full list, which is probably about 5,000 to 6,000 entries, he or she can easily pull out the utility projects in there, and we make sure that we don't miss those. And we'll cover the service contracts in the following slide and labor cost data in a subsequent slide during this presentation. Now the utility engineer can go to the environmental section of the squadron to ask for a list of projects in which permits were generated. Like the ACES data pool, the utility manager can review that list to see where the utility work comes from for environmental permits. Service contracts and SABRE IDIQ contracts are broken out here to explain the need for this information. A lot of times people want to know why the utility engineer should request this data. Well, have you ever seen a utility patch or a pavement patch where they have repaired a utility line in the road? A lot of times that work was done on an IDIQ delivery order. Or maybe you have a new water line that was installed and you have to use a SABRE contract to do the work because it wasn't quite large enough to be executed as a project, but it was too large to be completed by the in-house personnel. We see a lot of the service contract data where contractors will come in periodically, whether it be monthly, quarterly, or yearly, and they'll recalibrate meters, service the lift stations, perform pressure testing on gas lines, or other service-related activities. So it is important for the utility engineer to find out what type of service contracts are performed on the base to get this relevant utility data. Now, for the slide, first the utility engineer should check with the ops flight to find out if the service contract data is entered in IWIMS. If not, he or she should go to the financial management section and ask for a list of all delivery orders. The utility engineer should be able to get a list of all the delivery orders from there, and by doing that, the engineer will be able to pull out more of the utility expenses in service contracts and IDIQ contracts. Shops have a tendency to enter their work into account codes that they have historically used in the past. A lot of bases do not understand what the account codes mean and how they impact cost and budgets. For example, exterior electric shops will enter all their work into the account code 53015, which is the electrical distribution account code. Within that account code, there is a cost for, say, Christmas tree lighting, replacing the lights on a ball field, changing bay lights in aircraft hangars. It's any high-reach work that the exterior electric shop will normally do. So knowing that it's important to understand the summary total for the account code 53015 and the BCE end-of-year cost report, you have to understand that they may not contain work exclusively just for electrical distribution, because the examples I just gave you for like Christmas tree lighting or replacing light bulbs on the ball field aren't exactly straight electrical distribution work. So if that's included in that account code, then that account code does not have all the accurate data that we need for it to have. So the only way to really find out what is included in the account code is to periodically check the work order and the IWIMS data to see if the work is being coded correctly. So that's why in the slide we say export the data into Excel. So you can go to the ops flight and get them to export it into Excel so you can see the information in front of you so that you can pull out what needs to be pulled for each of the account codes. It is not the utility manager's responsibility to ensure the work is coded correctly. However, because he or she is the end user, it is their responsibility to ensure that the receipt of accurate utility cost. So working with the ops flight in conjunction with the financial management section will help in obtaining this information. The financial management section also wants to get accurate data because they use the budget codes for the end of year fin plans and for requesting money for the next year. The table at the bottom of this slide shows examples of incorrect account code entries. The first one, we have a hot water leak between buildings, which is said to be water supply and distribution. Hot water is not part of the water supply and distribution account. It may be hot water plant operations, but it's not water supply and distribution. Or we have one that was listed in water supply and distribution as missing a smoke alarm. Again, that may be electrical work, but it is definitely not water supply and distribution. And finally, one of the work order titles that we saw was repair chilled line between at a building. Well, the repair of the chilled water line would be part of a chilled plant code, but it's not part of the water supply and distribution. So these are just examples of the things that you should look for when going through work order data.
All of a base's utility costs are related to either a commodity component or a distribution of the commodity. And we'll show some more details of that as we go through the next couple slides. A commodity itself will either be purchased or produced, or sometimes a combination of purchased and produced. If it's produced, it means it's produced by the base, on the base. It's called a commodity when it's delivered by the local utility to the installation substation or master meter, and the distribution system is owned either by the installation or a utility privatization contractor. In this situation, the local utility company does not, I repeat, does not own the on-base distribution system. If, however, as we've discussed previously, the local utility company does own the on-base distribution system and delivers the commodity to the buildings on the base, it is utility service. The same thing is true if the same contractor owns the base sewage collection system and the wastewater treatment plant. That is utility service. In either case, the cost is available from the monthly invoice. When the commodity is produced on base, there are some cost components that are related to the production of that commodity. For example, if a plant's being operated, there'll be labor associated with it. There'll be projects to keep the plant up and running. There's always chemicals, fuel, perhaps other utilities, and we'll talk about those later, and capital. All those costs are required to produce a commodity on base. Here are some of the cost components for a government-owned distribution system. They include O&M of the system, for example, people, trucks, materials and supplies to keep the system running, any projects that have to be done are completed in order to keep the system running, and the capital to build the system. We show a privatized utility distribution system, and the contractor takes care of all the costs associated with owning, operating, and maintaining that system, and those costs are available from the invoices from that contractor. There are some costs associated with producing the commodity, and some costs associated with the distribution of that commodity. They have to be separated. And the reason they have to be separated and identified separately is the production costs are charged to all customers, whereas the distribution costs are only charged to non-federal customers. If we talk about commodity production, just some examples for you. Water, it may be pumped from the wells on the base. Sewage treatment plants owned by the government and operated to treat the wastewater on the base. Electricity could be generated from a fossil fuel, solar, or a waste energy plant. Thing to remember is you have to identify all the costs of producing the commodity. That's important. Now, Fred is going to discuss the sources of data for the cost of a base produced commodity.
All right, the annual cost to operate the production facilities and quantities produced are used to calculate basic cost. So what we want you to do is use the actual utility operations and maintenance costs to compute utility sales rates. And you can get these from the ops flights. And some of the things you're looking for are to make sure that you include your civilian and your military labor, but make sure you show them separately. Because as you can see as you will see if you look at a 3556, there's a column for military labor that is separated from that of civilian labor. So we have to ensure that when you get those labor costs that you do separate them. And also you have to get your vehicle, material, and equipment cost, and as we talked about earlier, your service contracts and maintenance contract cost. Now also, the IWIMS has a listing of collection work order account codes that we use, but you have to make sure that the work order descriptions on those codes are correct. Because as we have talked about before, if you get the wrong account code and the wrong work order type, then you will not classify the work in the right account code. And that can come back and haunt us later. Also, we want you to make sure that you go to the ops superintendent to review the account codes periodically. Because one of the things we're finding is that the data that has been entered under the incorrect account codes. And then one of the things we say here too is check your shop codes against your account codes periodically. So what you need to know is that the shop code indicates the shop doing the work, and the account code indicates the specific work being completed. So just go and talk with the ops superintendent to ensure that that information is being documented correctly. And also ensure that you get the studies, fees, and design cost from your engineering flights that also have utility-related expenses in them. As for the data input for utility labor cost, as you know, it takes personnel to operate the utility plants. Some, like the steam plants, are fully manned and operated. Others, such as the water treatment facilities, may have personnel who are only operationally maintain the plant, and in this case, to treat the water periodically. For those periodically operated plants, we get into a situation in which we must determine the full-time equivalent workload. As we have already noted, the cost to produce a utility is separate from the cost to distribute and to deliver the utility. So labor cost data is part of the expense to produce a utility and spread across all the customers. So it is important that the utility engineer obtain the correct data to be used in determining the sales rate. So for bullet 3, we say if shops do not enter costs into IWIMS, costs come from civil service payroll or from support contracts. So the utility engineer needs to go to the financial management section to get that information. And if the costs are not tracked separately, then you have to estimate the full-time equivalents based on the operations flight numbers. So you can go and discuss that with the operations flight. Now for the next slide, we talk about including natural gas or fuel oil for boilers used in steam plants, and also including cost of all materials, supplies, and chemicals used in production of the commodity. We just want to remind you that that's some of those utility expenses that you may not think about when you're trying to find the information to calculate your rates. So we need you to go there and look for those because those are part of your base produced commodity. Over to Jim.
On this slide, we're showing the input to the 3556 The example is a base produced water commodity that has a distribution system that's been privatized. You'll see here that there's some military labor that's used to produce the commodity. And we're going to explain in the next couple of slides why military labor has to be tracked and entered separately. Okay. Now, since the water distribution system has been privatized, the capital investment cost of facilities entry includes only the cost of the production facilities. And that number does not include the capital investment for the distribution system. This slide shows how other utility costs are calculated and entered onto the Air Force Form 3556. For example, when the base produces a utility commodity, there may be other utility costs involved in the production of that commodity. Examples are, for water, there may be electricity used to pump the water. For wastewater operations, there may be electricity used for a sewage lift station. For any plant operation, we're talking those costs that are related to electricity, natural gas, heating, chilled water, potable water, any utilities that are used to collect, pump, treat, and dispose of wastewater. All these are costs related to the production of that commodity. And we need to identify and include all of these other utility costs in the cost of commodity production. These other costs are calculated using the worksheet on Part 2 of Air Force Form 3556. This is usually called the reverse side of the Air Force Form. Example is following, which shows the monthly electricity used for producing water. It's based on the kilowatt hours. The example of water production is shown in the following slide. This example includes the monthly electricity used to pump the water. The cost is based on the DOD utility sales rate, and the charge is calculated and then automatically transferred to the front of the Air Force Form 3556. You can see that on this part of the form, this is on the reverse side of the 3556, there's an entry there for the electricity used monthly for pumping water. Here's the calculation. Based on the monthly electricity used for pumping the water, the DOD rate for the electricity, a monthly cost of electricity is calculated. That monthly cost is then multiplied by 12, because we have 12 months in a year, and divided by the total quantity of water provided in a year, to come up with a water rate related to this electricity. You can see on this that the electricity rate, the 0.07759 cents per kilowatt hour, used in this example is from the example Air Force Form 3556 for electricity. Here's the explanation of why military labor has to be tracked and entered separately on the form. DOD customers do not pay the military labor component of the utility sales rate. However, the non-federal and non-DOD federal customers do pay the military labor costs associated with providing utility service. Here's an example, 3556, it's a base produced water commodity, and it shows that the military labor was incurred in the production of the commodity. You can see there, you have a production cost including military labor, you have military labor, and you have the cost less military labor. Now Fred is going to talk about some sources of data for the distribution system O&M cost.
All right, much like the cost for production or producing the commodity, you also have costs for distribution for the commodity for the system O&M. And in this case, the system operations maintenance costs include all routine maintenance and repair. So if the repair does not add value or capacity to the system, then it should not be included in the system O&M section. So again, much like we do in the production cost, we also have certain items or components that we use for the operation and maintenance for the distribution system, which include, again, the civilian and military labor, and vehicles, materials, and equipment, and service contracts and maintenance contracts. And again, much like what we had to do for production, we also have to make sure that those costs are entered in the IWIMS correctly. So we have to ensure that we go to that the utility engineer goes to the operations flight with the operations superintendent and ensures that the account codes are correct. And again, we also want to make sure that we check the shop codes against the account codes periodically. We also want to identify and enter any military labor cost that we have, along with studies, fees, design and construction costs from the engineering flight, because we are always looking for expenses in either in the utility distribution or the utility production that are utility related. So that's why we must go back in and ensure that we look at the different things that we might forget sometimes, like the studies, the fees, and designs. And then we enter that cost in the O&M section called the Utility Systems O&M on the Form 3556.
Here you can see this is an example electric service, and it will show the distribution system O&M cost. You can see the account code 53015. That's the collection work order account code for utility system O&M costs, and that work order collects all those associated costs in IWIMS. You can also see that the distribution system O&M costs are entered as shown on the 3556. Utility sales rate calculations. We're going to talk about the rate calculation section of the Air Force Form 3556. And what this shows is the result of those data entries that have been made on the front and reverse sides of the 3556. Here you can see the blank Air Force Form 3556. This is the lower section, or the rate calculation section of the form. So the basic cost is the cost of a purchased or produced commodity. A couple things you can note there. For housing, that rate excludes any UP and ESPC UESC costs. Also, as we've discussed previously, the DOD and MWR rates will exclude military labor. Here's the 3556 example. It's a base produced water with a privatized distribution system. You can see that the basic cost for military family housing excludes those UP and UESC ESPC costs. The DOD and MWR cost excludes military labor. This is an overview of the O&M charge for utility distribution system. Now, non-federal customer rate includes the O&M charge. For those federal customers, in accordance with DOD 4000.19, which is support agreements, it says specifically that federal customers are not to be charged for the on-base utility distribution system O&M cost, except for support provided solely for the benefit of one or more receivers. That means that a sole benefit test has to be applied to federal customers to see if they must pay for distribution system costs. And we're going to talk about that more in the next slide. So the sole benefits test for federal customers means this. If the distribution system is provided solely for the benefit of one or more receivers, then any O&M that is done to that system is charged to those tenants on an as incurred basis. This means that the distribution system O&M costs are not included in the Air Force Form 3556. Any project work that is done on the distribution system is billed to the tenant at the time that work is done. This is an example 3556 for electric service, showing the O&M costs. You can see there's a spot there for as incurred O&M charge. That is solely a reminder. The O&M charge is not going to show up there for those federal customers. You can see for the non-federal customers, there is a distribution O&M cost shows up on this form in that block. We talked previously about other utility costs. This cost was calculated on the reverse side of the 3556. And now we're going to show you where that shows up on the 3556 front side. You can see here's the rate calculation section, the line item for other utility costs. You can see that this shows up on that line of the utility costs from the reverse side of the Form 3556. In this example, which is the base produced water, this was the cost of electricity used for pumping water from the wells. We'll talk about line losses on this slide. When you distribute electricity, water, or natural gas, there are natural losses that occur in the distribution of the commodity. When you collect wastewater, there are natural gains that happen in the collection of the wastewater. The line losses or gains are a cost of operating the system. It's a cost of doing business, and as such, those costs are included on the 3556. A engineering analysis can be done of the base system to determine what the losses or gains are, or if you're unable to do that, a default factor of 10% can be used. The 3556 calculates the line loss. It's based on the percentage entered. The only thing you have to remember is the number that's entered. If the line loss is determined to be 10%, the number 10 is entered. Okay? It's not 0.1. Here's the example, 3556 for electric service, showing a line loss of 10%, and the form then calculates the cost of that line loss in each of the customer classifications. This slide discusses connection fees, and we're going to tell you what's going on there. A connection fee is a payment for any facility charge. It might be a new service charge. It's any kind of a fee imposed by the utility providing service. This charge can be paid at one time, or it can be paid over a period of time. If it's paid over a period of time, it shows up on the monthly bill. So the connection fee is showing up in the purchased utility cost. However, MWR does not pay connection fees, so they're entered here so they can be deducted from the MWR rate. The Air Force Form 3556 electric service example, you can see the annual connection fee payment is entered in the correct place, and there's a calculation that results in a credit for the MWR rate. It's deducted for the MWR rate. This shows how capital charges are calculated by the form. To calculate the unit cost of capital charges, the form divides 10% of the total capital cost by the total annual capacity of the system. And we'll show you how that charge shows up on the form on the next slide. Here you can see the example 3556 for electric service, and the capital charge element is calculated by the form and shows up right there. Here we'll discuss the administrative overhead cost. That's included in the utility sales rates for non-federal customers. This cost is to recoup the cost of you doing all this, you and everyone else doing the services that are required to make this all happen for those non-federal customers. And what the form does is calculates the subtotal of all other costs and multiplies that subtotal by 3%. And you can see how this works on the next slide. Let's go to slide 74. Here's the electric service example once more. You can see the subtotal of all costs is calculated, and then on the line below that, the 3% of the subtotal is calculated by the 3556. We have 5 classes of customers, and this section of the form shows the rates calculated for each of those customer classes. Here's a blank form, 3556, and you can see the details on utility rates charged to the customer. These are the rate cost elements in the order as found or discussed in the lower section of the Air Force Form 3556. Details are found in AFI 32-1061, Chapter 4. These are the fundamental elements of cost used to determine the reimbursement charges for utility service. The utility sales rate for each class of customer will include some or all of these components. The details are found in 32-1061, so I'm not going to read them to you. Next slide shows the rate for housing. So here you can see the housing rate details. You can see that UESC, ESPC, capital, and admin costs are not included in the basic cost. You notice also the distribution system O&M cost charge from the form is not included for housing. The only O&M charge that would be charged to housing would be determined by the sole benefit test, and the project work that was done would be billed directly to that customer when it's performed. So here you can see how that result is shown on the 3556. This is the electric service example. It shows the housing rate with those charges included and excluded as discussed. These are the cost elements charged to a non-federal customer. The base needs to collect all the costs of providing service to those customers in accordance with 32 USC 9701. This rate includes each and every charge that we have discussed, but it isn't over yet. The next slide discusses one more thing for you to consider for non-federal customers. The non-federal sales rate includes all the costs of providing service. For non-federal government, non-commercial customers, they pay that calculated rate, the non-federal rate. However, the rate that's charged to a customer of similar characteristic is called the local prevailing rate. And we consider that local prevailing rate when we determine the charge for non-federal commercial customers. A non-federal commercial customer, like a bank or a credit union, will pay the higher of the calculated non-federal rate from the 3556 or the local prevailing rate, whichever is higher. So after the non-federal rate is calculated, it must be compared to the local prevailing rate to determine the rate for commercial non-federal entities. The reason for this is the base does not want to compete for customers of the local utility by providing cheaper service. This is shown on the next slide. This is the 3556 example for base produced water, and you can see that the calculated non-federal rate is less than the local prevailing rate. So the local prevailing rate will be charged to non-federal commercial customers. These are the cost elements charged to a non-DOD federal customer. The basic cost will include any military labor in the commodity production. As far as O&M charges, any military labor in O&M projects that are subject to the sole benefit test will also be charged. The distribution system O&M cost charge from the Air Force Form 3556 is not included. Any O&M charge is going to be billed directly to the customer when performed. There are no capital or administrative overhead charges included in the non-DOD federal rate. This is the Air Force Form 3556 base produced water example. What you see there is the non-DOD rate, and that rate does include military labor in the commodity production costs. Here you can see the cost elements that are charged to customers, the DOD customers, and golf courses. Okay? The DOD rate does not include military labor, capital, or administrative overhead. Any distribution system O&M cost is not included on the Form 3556. It would be billed under the sole benefit test directly to the customer when performed. Here's the 3556 example for base produced water, and these rates shown, if you notice, the DOD rate excludes military labor, and it is lower than the non-DOD federal rate. These are the cost elements for the MWR rate. If you notice, it includes the basic cost, utility privatization, and UESC ESPC costs. Here's a summary of those common problems that have shown up in the bumper stickers throughout the presentation. I'll mention a couple of them. Identify all the reimbursable customers. That's the only way these people will pay for service. They receive service regardless of whether you charge them or not. The only way they're going to pay is if you find them and send them bills. Use the current Air Force Form 3556 to ensure that the rates you are calculating are correct. Remember, the account codes on IWIM's work orders are not always correct. You need to check them. And last but not least, learn the AFI 321061. It is your friend.
This concludes Part 3, Calculating Utility Sales Rates. Additionally, we have two other presentations. Utility Sales Part 1, Executive Overview for Civil Engineering Management, and Utility Sales Part 2, Management Requirements for Operations Engineering and Installation Management flights.